Egypt, a civilization of over 5,000 years, centered at the heart of the Middle East, connecting Africa to Asia. A land and people known throughout the ages whose impact on other civilizations has been profound. Egyptians to this day still speak proudly of their ancient past, and pharaonic identity permeates throughout Egyptian society on official government documents and currency. Fast forward to the 20th century, 1952 to be exact, and Egypt was on the brink of social and political upheaval. Having been ruled as a kingdom for the past 150 years by the Muhammad Ali dynasty with roots from modern-day Albania, the then King Farouk found himself face to face with a group of military officers, forcing an on-the-spot abdication. In an unbloody and unclimactic move, the 150-year-old dynasty came to an end, and this day became known as the Revolution of 1952. For the first time since Pharaoh Nekhtenebo II in 350 BC, the rulership of Egypt fell back into the hands of native Egyptians, having been ruled for over 2,000 years by foreign occupiers and settlers. By many Egyptians, this was seen as a nationalistic movement led by patriotic Egyptian officers, sons of the land who had fought and died for it under epochs of different rulers, both native and foreign. A young officer who led the coup was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a name still so profound to this day that Egyptians on both sides of the political spectrum continue to have heated debates on. Nasser, along with his military comrades, founded the Arab Republic of Egypt, the current nation-state of Egypt we now know today. Since 1952, his legacy lives on, not only in the hearts and minds of young and old Egyptians, but also fellow Arab nationals across the Middle East, from Lebanon and Palestine to Yemen and Iraq. The political system that was set up by Nasser post-1952 fundamentally remains unchanged since then, with the military regime consolidating the majority of power and controlling various government apparatuses. Egypt has been in the hands of consecutive military officers for nearly 70 years. As it was in ancient times, Egypt is still a key world player and is still relevant as a broker with the growing tensions in the Middle East. Lying in a strategic geopolitical position in the wider Mediterranean and Middle East region, Egypt enjoys a powerful military and has the largest population of all the Arab and Middle Eastern nation-states, recently hitting the 100 million mark. But the question remains, what impact has Nasser's rule had on Egypt, and specifically Egyptian people, since the revolution of 1952? How does it compare with its predecessor, the Kingdom of Egypt, and has the change from kingdom to republic been a positive change for the generations of Egyptians that came after? Books upon books have already been written about Nasser's Egypt, so I've decided to break down this documentary into a mini-series, exploring the key defining moments of Nasser's career. Interestingly, before we jump into Nasser, it wasn't he who was the first president of the newly formed republic, but in fact Mohammed Naguib. Naguib was a more senior officer of the Free Officers Movement who led the 1952 revolution. It was thought that due to his more mature age, he should be the figurehead as the Egyptian president, with the then younger Nasser being in his 30s, leading behind the scenes as the de facto ruler. Sometimes when a short-lived historical period is overshadowed by a much longer one, its events, even though well documented, are lost to the annals of history. Naguib's presidency was one of those. He stayed in power for 2 years after being ousted by Nasser in 1954. Naguib was a dedicated Democrat who believed that the new republic should herald in a new era of democracy. He wanted to govern through parliament, believing that the military should return governance to civil society and withdraw. Despite Naguib's best intentions for his country and wanting a democratic transition, Nasser had other plans, and in 1954 forced the resignation of Naguib, putting him under effective house arrest for the next 20 years. Nasser had been the prime mover behind the scenes, and had too much support within the Revolution Command Committee for Naguib to survive. For the next 18 years, Nasser would exercise almost absolute power. A much more efficient administrator than the king had been, Nasser suppressed opposition ruthlessly, created a one-party state and controlled the media. In contrast, Naguib would have set Egypt on the path of multi-party democracy, with freedom of the press and a healthy civil society. Nasser had now become the strongman of Egypt, and from 1954 until his death in 1970 would leave a legacy carved in stone. From a political and economical angle, Nasser was a staunch socialist. Not to be confused with the Eastern Bloc's flavour of communism, Nasser developed a new form of socialism, often referred to as Arab socialism. This ideology, despite being a secular one, still accommodated towards the Arab world's traditions and Islamic and Christian heritage. With Arab socialism also later becoming known as Nasserism, Nasser led a wave of reforms throughout the country, and the national economy grew significantly through agrarian reform, major modernization projects such as the Halwan Steelworks and the Aswan Dam, and also nationalization schemes such as that of the Suez Canal. The original revolutionaries wanted an end to British occupation, but did not have a unified ideology or plan for Egypt. One issue that was agreed on and acted quickly was land reform. Less than 6% of Egypt's population owned more than 65% of the land in Egypt, and less than 0.5% of Egyptians owned more than 1/3 of all fertile land. The process of land reform began on September 11th, 1952, when, with among many provisions, a law prohibited ownership of more than 200 feddans or hectares of land. And this also led to limiting the rental rate for land, establishing cooperatives for farmers, and introducing minimum wages. During the presidency of Nasser, land cultivated in Egypt increased by almost 1/3, an achievement that had reportedly eluded Egyptians for more than a millennium. At the time of the fall of the Egyptian monarchy in the early 1950s, less than 500,000 Egyptians were considered upper class and rich, 4 million middle class and 17 million lower class and poor. Fewer than half of all primary school aged children attended school, and most of them were boys. Nearly 75% of the population were over 10 years of age, and over 90% of all females were illiterate. Nasser's policies changed this. Land reform, the major assets confiscation program, the dramatic growth in university education, the creation of dominating public sector flattened the social curve. From the academic year of 1953-1954 through 1965-66, overall public school enrollments more than doubled. Millions of previously poor Egyptians, through education and jobs in the public sector, joined the middle class. Doctors, engineers, teachers, lawyers, journalists constituted the bulk of the swelling middle class in Egypt under Nasser. Under Nasser, Egypt's economy grew at an average rate of 9% per annum for almost a decade. The share of manufacturing to Egypt's GDP rose from around 14% in the late 1940s to 35% by the early 1970s. The combination of the land reform program and the creation of the public sector in Egypt resulted in about 75% of Egypt's gross domestic product, GDP, being transferred from the hands of the country's rich, either to the state or to millions of small owners. The closest parallel to such a large-scale social program had been in the early days of Muhammad Ali Pasha's rule in the early 19th century Egypt. Nasser was a staunch anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist, especially after the humiliating defeat of Arab armies in the 1948 war by the newly formed Israeli state in which he fought in. The 1956 Suez Crisis was a reflection of both these sentiments, and was to be his defining moment where he stood up to global powers, climaxing in an unexpected victory, forever etching him as a hero in the eyes of the Arab nationalists. The Suez Crisis was provoked by an American and British decision not to finance Egypt's construction of the Aswan High Dam, as they had promised, in response to Egypt's growing ties with communist Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. Nasser reacted to the American and British decision by declaring martial law in the Canal Zone and seizing control of the Suez Canal Company, predicting that the tolls collected from the ships passing through the canal would pay for the dam's construction within 5 years. Britain and France feared that Nasser might close the canal and cut off shipments of petroleum flowing from the Persian Gulf to Western Europe. When diplomatic efforts to settle the crisis failed, Britain and France secretly prepared military action to regain control of the canal, and, if possible, to depose of Nasser. They found a ready ally in Israel, whose hostility towards Egypt had been exacerbated by Nasser's blockade of the Straits of Tiran, at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba, and the numerous raids by Egyptian-supported commandos into Israel during 1955 to 1956. On the 29th of October 1956, 10 Israeli brigades invaded Egypt and advanced towards the canal, routing Egyptian forces. Britain and France, following their plan, demanded that Israeli and Egyptian troops withdraw from the canal, and they announced that they would intervene to enforce a ceasefire ordered by the United Nations. On November the 5th and 6th, British and French forces landed at Port Said and Port Fouad and began occupying the canal zone under this guise. The move was soon met by growing opposition at home and by the US-sponsored resolutions in the UN, made in part to counter Soviet threats of intervention, which quickly put a stop to the Anglo-French action. On December the 22nd, the UN evacuated British and French troops, and Israeli forces withdrew in March of 1957. Nasser emerged from the Suez Crisis as a victor and a hero for the cause of Arab and Egyptian nationalism. Israel did not win freedom to use the canal, but it did regain shipping rights in the Straits of Tiran. Britain and France, less fortunate, lost most of their influence in the Middle East, and as a result of this episode. In this part of our mini-series on Gamal Abdel Nasser, we've explored a strongman who believed in bringing socialist reforms to his country and promoting anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist sentiment to his wider Arab audience. He worked to improve the lower classes' economic situation by improving literacy, education, and land ownership, as well as nationalization programs that sought to bring ownership of Egyptian assets back into the hands of Egyptians. The middle class was also able to grow significantly, with skilled jobs such as lawyers, doctors, and engineers growing into a sizable bulk of the Egyptian workforce. Despite this, his time in power was overshadowed by a regime apparatus that suppressed political opposition. There was no other political parties that could realistically oppose Nasser, and his ousting of the first president Mohammad Naguib was a reflection that he was not interested in a multi-party system. In the next part of this series, we will explore further key events, from the union of Egypt with Syria, leading to the First United Arab Republic, to the 1967 Six-Day War, leading to the defeat of Egypt and loss of significant lands to the Israelis. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more historical content like this.